So first of all, I would like to give you my credentials for being the speaker today. I'm going to talk about the history of the Palestine-Israeli conflict, or the Arab-Jewish conflict in Palestine. And my credentials are, I'm not Israeli, I'm not Palestinian, and I'm not an historian. So I expect to learn something from you guys. I'm a neurophysiologist, and truly this is a hobby. I've gotten interested in the Palestinian conflict, spent a long time in the Library of Congress trying to develop a course that covered both sides of the conflict, and this is going to be a 18-minute summary of a 15-week course. So I'm going to leave some things out, and I'm sure I'm going to leave some of your favorite things out, and I'll hear from all of you, whether it's the historian in the audience or whether it's some of my Israeli and Palestinian friends here. And we're talking about history as Paul describes it, history that's being told while the war is still going on. Let me introduce, though, a little bit about narratives, or at least the way I use the word. There is no history that covers all of the millions or billions of events that take place in any given period of time in the world. There is no history like that. Every history we read is indeed a narrative. It's a selection of those events, no matter how objective it is. It's a selection of those events that tell a particular story. The story of World War I, how World War I, or in the case of World War II, the story that's being told downtown at the mall is the story of the American participation in World War II. It's not the story of World War II at all. It's a particular story. And in the case of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the two narratives, the Palestinian narrative, and even if I look upon the most academic of those narratives, let's say a history book written by Walid Khalidi, or Rashid Khalidi, his son, or a history written by Martin Gilbert, a well-known British historian, what I get are two completely different stories, and they're about the same conflict. And in all honesty, I think if a naive person were to be presented with these two historic narratives, he would be hard-pressed to realize they're talking about the same conflict. That's how disparate they are. And I think they're that disparate for two reasons. First of all, each of those narratives, that is to say, the history of the Arab-Jewish conflict in Palestine, okay? That's what we're talking about, the history of the conflict. The history of that conflict is in each case part of a different national history. In one case, it's the part of the national history of the Jewish people, or the Jewish nation, if you like, and in the other one, it's part of the history, a longer history of the Palestinian nation, or the Palestinian people. And each of those two histories, okay, has most of their history taking place in different parts of the world. They're separate from each other. It's only since the 1880s that we get the two together in the same place. So they're coming from different places. But more important, I think, to explain the disparateness of the two historical accounts, the two historical narratives, is the fact that they each tell a different story. They're meant to tell a different story. The Palestinian narrative is the history of the European Jewish immigration or immigration to Palestine and its colonization of Palestine, and eventually the dispossession of the Palestinian population, or most of the Palestinian population, from that area, and the decimation of the Arab civilization, if you like, in Palestine, or in that portion of Palestine that became Israel. The Jewish narrative is a totally different story. It's a story of the return of a people to an ancient homeland and their resurrection, if you like, of themselves as a national entity in what they consider to be their ancient homeland after some 2,000 years of being oppressed, dispersed, ultimately being attacked nearly with genocide in the diaspora. So it's the return and if you like, the salvation and the reuniting of a Jewish nation in what it considers its historic homeland. Those are two very different stories, and different events are going to play into them. So even if we look at versions of the narrative that are 95% factual and only 5% mythical, and there's some myth in both narratives, no matter which version of the narrative you look at, whether you look at the national versions that average person knows in the street, or if you look at the versions written by academic historians, in either case, there's some myth in both of them. But both of them are mostly facts, but not necessarily the same facts, because it's not the same facts that make up those two stories. So, These are two basically true stories, two basically true histories, overwhelmingly true histories, but very different. The Palestinian narrative, I will try to summarize, and I say, I'm not Palestinian. This is certainly not your personal narratives. These are not your personal stories. This is the stories that this is what one reads if one reads Walid Khalidi or Rashid Khalidi or someone like that. The Palestinian narrative of the history of the conflict. In both cases, the narratives begin before the conflict does, because the story is rooted in ancient history, in both cases. This is my version, if you like, my version of the Palestinian narrative. Before the Hebrews ever migrated to Canaan, the land was occupied by Canaanites. Many present-day Palestinians are probably descendants of those Canaanites. They are the true indigenous people of Palestine. The Jewish kingdoms were only one of many governments that ruled ancient Palestine. By the end of the 7th century, Palestine had become an overwhelmingly Arab Islamic country and remained so for 1,200 continuous years. Then, at the close of the 19th century, a European colonialist movement called Zionism began to invade Palestine with the intention of taking over Palestine and turning it into a Jewish state. There had been, at the time, a small Jewish minority living in Palestine for centuries, and they coexisted peacefully with the Arab Muslim majority until Zionism introduced conflict and violence. The Zionist movement, from the beginning, aspired to a practically complete dispossession of the indigenous Arab population so that Israel could be a wholly Jewish state. At the start, land bought by the Jewish National Fund the Jewish National Fund bought as much land as it could afford as possible. That land, bought by them and by other Zionist corporations, was kept for sole use by Jews. They attached restrictive covenants to the land so that it could never be sold or even leased back to Arabs. That situation continues to the present day. As the Arab community in Palestine became increasingly aware of the Zionist intentions, they began more and more to resist Jewish immigration and Jewish purchases of land because they began to understand the real danger it posed to the continued existence of Arab society in Palestine. Because of this opposition, the entire Zionist project could never have been realized without the military backing of the British. In short, Zionism was based on an illegitimate colonialist worldview that the rights of the indigenous inhabitants didn't matter. The Arabs' opposition to Zionism was not based on anti-Semitism, but rather on a totally reasonable fear of the dispossession of their people and the destruction of their existing society. The Balfour Declaration, issued in 1917 by the British government, was made by a European power, but it concerned a non-European territory. And it disregarded the presence and the wishes of the native majority residents of that territory. Arab violence started around 1920 and was a fully justified attempt to stop a Zionist British colonialist conspiracy to deprive Palestinians of their legitimate national rights. It's actually a quote. I'll tell you that. The Zionists convinced European Jews to move to Palestine by telling them it was a land without people for a people without land. But that was a lie. Palestine was home to hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs at that time, and the only way it could be turned into a Jewish homeland was to expel the Arabs. In 1919, the American King Crane Commission spent 6 weeks in Palestine interviewing delegations and reading petitions, and their report stated in part, and I quote, "The commissioners began their study of Zionism with minds predisposed in its favor. The fact came out repeatedly in the Commission's conferences with Jewish representatives that the Zionists looked forward to a practically complete dispossession of the present non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine by various forms of purchase." The report continues later with these words. "If the principle of self-determination," I filled in the and self-determination, it's essentially a quote, "if the principle of self-determination is to rule, and so the wishes of Palestine's population are to be decisive as to what is to be done with Palestine, then it's to be remembered that the non-Jewish population of Palestine, nearly 9/10 of the whole, are emphatically against the entire Zionist program. To subject the people so minded to unlimited Jewish immigration and to steady financial and social pressure to surrender the land would be a gross violation of the principle just quoted, the principle of self-determination." And later the report continues, "The initial claim, often submitted by Zionist representatives that they have a right to Palestine based on occupation of 2,000 years ago, can barely be seriously considered." That's the end of my quote from the King Crane Commission report to the United States government. By 1929, the danger that Zionism posed to the indigenous Arab population of Palestine became obvious to John Chancellor, then the British High Commissioner for Palestine. He recommended total suspension of Jewish immigration and land purchase in order to protect Arab agriculture. He said, quote, all cultivable land was occupied, that no cultivable land now in possession of the indigenous population could be sold to Jews without creating a landless Arab cultivars, a class of landless Arab cultivars. The Colonial Office rejected the recommendation. Back in London, his recommendations were rejected. The Arabs rejected the UN partition plan in 1947 because it was unjust and illegal. The action of the United Nations conflicted with the basic principles for which the World Organization was established, namely to uphold the right of all peoples to self-determination. By denying the Palestinian Arabs, who formed two-thirds of the majority of the country, who formed a two-thirds majority of the country, the right to decide the future of Palestine for themselves, the UN had violated its own charter. Nor did the UN vote really reflect world opinion. By 1947, the United States had become a strong proponent of partition, and the United States got the General Assembly to delay a vote to give it and the Zionist leaders more time to get some delegates from South America and Africa to change their votes. Without that pressure from the United States on those governments that could not afford to risk American displeasure, the resolution would never have even passed. The Zionists were better equipped and better organized than the Palestinians, and when civil war broke out between them and Palestine, the Zionists not only captured the half of Palestine that the UN had suggested be a Jewish state, but also half of what was supposed to be the Arab state. In order to turn now 3/4 of Palestine into a state with a large Jewish majority, they expelled 750,000 Arabs from Palestine. Many of those expelled at that time and their descendants remain stateless refugees to this day. In 1967, the Israeli army occupied the remaining 1/4 of Palestine, and since then, Israel has been engaged in a process of colonizing that last piece of Arab Palestine by building Jews-only settlements there and using different ways to force out the native Palestinian population. That is a 10, 12-minute summary of the Palestinian narrative as I hear it and as I read it. This is it's more what I would call the national narrative than the historic record as Walid Khalidi would write it, but it's not very far from the more academic version of the Palestinian narrative. Let's compare that now to the Jewish narrative of the same conflict. About 3,000 years ago, Hebrew-speaking tribes in Canaan evolved into the Israelite nation and formed a kingdom. Under King David, they made Jerusalem their national and spiritual capital. However, a civil war erupted between the north and south, and the kingdom was split into two. The northern kingdom disappeared from history, but the southern kingdom, called Judea, remained in one form or another for all of 3,000 years until today. That is to say, the nation remained intact as an identifiable nation, the Judean nation, or the Jews. In the year 70, approximately, of the Common Era, the Romans forced most of the Judeans into exile. The displaced Jews ended up scattered throughout much of the world, part in the rest of the Middle East and part in Europe, but they never lost their identity as Judeans, or as Jews, as we're called in English. After the Middle East was conquered by Muslim armies, treatment of the Jewish minorities varied greatly. In many places, Jews were treated as second-class citizens, dhimmi. They were not permitted to wear swords or daggers or other symbols of status. They were not allowed to walk on the sidewalk. They were forced to walk in the roadway with the animals. They were compelled to pay higher taxes than Muslims paid, and the height and locations of synagogues was severely restricted. Much of the maltreatment of Jews in the Muslim world stemmed from statements in the Quran that refer to Jews as descendants of apes and pigs, and the Hadith that says that the Day of Judgment cannot come until Muslims kill all the Jews. Anti-Semitism became endemic in many strains of Muslim society. However, the Jews who ended up in Europe fared much worse as Christianity spread throughout the continent. For centuries, Christian clergy demonized the Jews as killers of Christ, and Jewish suffering and oppression were portrayed as divine punishment for the crime of deicide. For centuries, European Jews were severely oppressed, attacked, often massacred, in country after country in Europe. The bulk were repeatedly driven out of country after country, in the western part of Europe especially, and mostly ended up in the eastern portions or the Pale of the Russian Empire. So it's probably no surprise that for 2 millennia, the Jews who lived in exile prayed several times a day for God to return them to the land of Israel. There was always a small core of Jews living in Palestine, some from families that had never left, others who returned from time to time over the centuries. But for most Jews during the centuries of exile, the idea of returning seemed an impossible dream, one that might not be possible till the Messiah came. Finally, during the 1870s and the 1880s, the Jewish population in Europe began more actively to discuss immigration back to Israel, back to Eretz Israel, back to Palestine, and the reestablishment of the Jewish nation in its national homeland, fulfilling both a secular existential aspiration as well as several biblical commandments. In 1882, the first modern Zionist settlement, Rishon LeZion, which means first in Zion, was founded by immigrants who belonged to a movement called Chovevei Zion, which means lovers of Zion. Chovevei is Habibi, same root. Excuse me?
That's the
same word. A few years later, the Bilu movement established other settlements in the land of Israel. The modern Zionist movement was officially founded in 1884, and the first World Zionist Congress was held in 1897. Theodor Herzl, a totally secular journalist from Vienna, had little interest in biblical commandments or Jewish historical ties to the Promised Land. In 1894, he was sent to Paris, where he witnessed the unjust conviction of Alfred Dreyfus and the widespread outbreak of French anti-Semitism that followed the trial. He became disillusioned with the French promise of equality for the Jews and devoted the rest of his life to leading the struggle to establish a Jewish state for the Jewish nation. During the First World War, Great Britain captured Palestine from the Turks, from the Ottoman Empire. The League of Nations then announced the establishment of a new world order that they hoped would prevent that kind of war again. The world was to be composed of independent democratic nation states. Every nation was to have its own state. That was the concept. Among the nations that were promised self-determination in this new world order was indeed the Jewish nation. When the League of Nations created the Palestine Mandate and incorporated as a principle of international law the right of the Jewish nation to reestablish their national home in Palestine. From that time, it became a matter of international law that Jews had a right to migrate to Palestine. So Jews began to migrate to the land they called Eretz Israel, and they began to build there the infrastructure of a modern state. They purchased land from Arab landowners and from Arab villages, often at exorbitant prices. On some of the purchased land, they established kibbutzim, a unique form of totally democratic communal agricultural settlement. On some sand dunes near Jaffa, they built Tel Aviv, the first Hebrew city to exist in 2,000 years. They established a democratic system of self-government in the Yishuv, which is what they call the organized Jewish community in Palestine. The Yishuv was the name in Hebrew for that community. They built a road system to connect the agricultural settlements and the Jewish villages to the cities. They established a system of labor unions, pensions, medical care, a complete Hebrew educational system, including modern world-class universities, technical schools, scientific research institutions, and so on. By 1935, the Jewish state was a de facto reality, although it did not yet enjoy independence. From the 1800s, the very beginning of increased Jewish migration to Palestine, and long before Great Britain got involved, the Arabs in Palestine responded to Jewish immigration with violence. In March 1886, after the men of the new Jewish village of Petah Tikva left for work, an Arab mob from the nearby village of Yehud attacked the women and children of Petah Tikva. News of what was then described as a barbaric attack terrorized the Yishuv, and they began slowly to replace what until then were hired Arab guards with Jewish ones. From 1886 to 1914, the Jewish populations of Merchavia, Nes Ziona, Kinneret, Hadera, Rehovot, Ben Shemen, Gedera, Sechera, Degania, Merchavia, and Yavneel all came under Arab attack. In 1907, the Yishuv, responding to these attacks, organized a formal organization of guards to provide protection to Jewish communities all over Palestine from Arab attacks. It was called Bar Giora, but in 2 years it morphed into another organization called Shomer, the Guard. After the more wide-scale Arab attacks of 1920 and 21, the Yishuv leadership realized they could not rely on the British administration for protection from Arab attacks, and the Shomer organization was transformed into an underground paramilitary defense force to protect Jewish villages, farms, and kibbutzim. The force was called the Haganah, the defense. Still more severe Arab massacres of Jews occurred during the 1929 Palestine riots, and again in 36 and 39, and then Haganah was relied on more and more as a defense force for the Jewish community in Palestine. In the 1940s, 6 million Jews, 2/3 of the Jews of Europe, were exterminated in the Holocaust. The remnant of the population ended up in displaced persons camps demanding the right to go to Palestine. In November 1947, at the recommendation of a special committee sent to investigate the situation in Palestine, UNSCOP, the fledgling United Nations organization voted on a two-state solution to the conflict in Palestine to create both a Jewish and Arab state there. The Jews accepted the resolution, the Arab states rejected it, and vowed to go to war to prevent its implementation. Civil war broke out between the Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine the day after the UN vote. On May 14, 1948, the day Israel declared its independence, the states of the Arab League invaded Palestine and joined the war against the infant Jewish state. The Arab states refused to sign a peace treaty or to recognize the Jewish state, and with the exception of Jordan and Egypt, the official state of war between Israel and members of the Arab League remains to this day. Those are 10-minute summaries of the two narratives. These are the narratives, or these are at least this is the, and by the way, when I discussed this before, I mentioned that coexisted-minded Jewish and Palestinian educators have attempted at first to write a single common historic narrative. By the way, that was the original intent of that group, to write a common historical narrative that Jewish and Palestinian educators, Israeli Jewish and Palestinian Arab educators could agree upon. They did not succeed, and they decided instead to write a textbook meant for actually lower grades in this case, a textbook with the two narratives in two separate columns and a third column blank in the middle. I forgot to bring my copy, and I have several copies at home, but that was the best they could do, is to do two narratives. There are several reasons why the rejection of the other narrative is so strong among Palestinians and Israelis, at least as I see it. National narratives that evolve amidst violent conflict end up being part history and part ammunition. The more radicalized Palestinian and Israeli narratives of the conflict incorporate a lot of elements that are mostly there to delegitimize or demonize the other. They compare the other to Nazis or to apartheid South Africa or to imperialism. The Jews are often depicted in certain Palestinian narratives as being a religion, not a nation, and therefore having no legitimate claim to a national homeland. The very concept of a Jewish state is depicted as racist. The Palestinians are often depicted in Jewish narratives as culturally and ethnically indistinguishable from the rest of the Arab nation, and therefore not existing as really a separate nation with a right to a separate state. And their identity as a separate Palestinian state was invented solely to deprive Jews of their rights in Palestine. Those are some examples of the more extreme versions of these same two narratives. These two narratives also use language to delegitimize the other. The Jewish narrative speaks of an Arab-Jewish conflict, but the Palestinian narrative speaks of Palestinian-Zionist conflict. What one calls the land of Israel, the other calls Palestine. What one narrative refers to as terrorism, the other calls armed struggle. What one calls Jewish migration, the other calls Zionist invasion. The two existing narratives appear irreconcilable. Transformations of the conflict to a less violent form may be possible in the near future, but real peace is going to require somehow acknowledging the two narratives and putting them behind us. And I think the first step in putting them behind us is understanding better what those two narratives are and how they have affected current thinking of Palestinians and Israelis. And maybe then we can find a way to move forward, because we need to put those two narratives behind us and move forward. Thank you.